You know, in this integrated rangeland management class, I talk about quite a few things I know something about and a few things I don't know very much about at all. And this topic today, targeted grazing, is one I know a lot about. So it's kind of fun to go through the elements that I think are important if you want to do vegetation management or landscape enhancement with targeted grazing. So here's those elements. First of all, when we started thinking about using livestock on vegetation, it takes quite a shift in paradigm. When I went to school, and most livestock producers think about using livestock to create meat and livestock products and sell those products to pay for the land and to pay for resources. Oftentimes, managing plant communities is something that is known as an effect of livestock grazing. Certainly changes in plant community are known, but it's seldom the product of livestock grazing. Targeted grazing is a shift from meat and livestock production to an emphasis on plant community management. So the first thing to do in targeted grazing is change your paradigm and your frame of reference. Targeted grazing, by definition, the book definition, is the application of a specific kind of livestock at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish a defined vegetation or landscape goal. That definition came out of a paper that was written by my graduate student Rachel Frost and I will post that on the class webpage so you can see the elements of targeted grazing. One thing that's really important is that targeted grazing has two important knowledge areas that you have to be good at. You have to have skills in understanding landscapes and be able to define and manage a landscape, and you also have to be able to manage grazing animals. So people that do targeted grazing well are unusual because they have skills both in understanding vegetation and landscapes, but also in understanding grazing animals. Some landscape goals that have been used, for which livestock grazing has been used, are old and many. Certainly for a long, long time, grazing was used to reduce weeds in croplands, pastures, and even on rangelands. Historically, back when crop systems were integrated with grazing systems, livestock were used a lot to eat crop aftermath or to manage weeds in crop systems. Controlling herbaceous biomass in tree crops is also very effective, whether that be in pine plantations, where the herbaceous biomass competes with the pine plantations, or in orchards, where removing that herbaceous biomass between trees yields more apples, cherries, peaches, or whatever. Even I'll talk a little bit about a fairly recent study where they reduced the herbaceous biomass between grape plants in a vineyard. Using livestock to manage wildlife habitat, we talked about that a few weeks ago. We're learning more and more every day about reducing the fire fuel loads on rangelands with grazing. We'll also talk about that in class. Managing watershed characteristics. When you start to think about how much water is harvested on a landscape and how the quality of that water, livestock grazing can be a part of that. And then finally, we're just starting to think about using livestock grazing in restoration tools to stomp down the ground, plant seeds, reform the landscape. So all of these are really legitimate uses of livestock to manage landscapes. Okay, we know that grazing is a powerful tool. Here's just one picture to show you how powerful grazing is. On the right-hand side is sheep grazing in the summer up in the Centennial Mountains, I believe this picture is from. On the left-hand side are all the forbs that would grow in this tall forb community without grazing. So this isn't even a level of overgrazing. This is just a level of sheep selecting forbs and leaving the grass behind so that the grass grows and the forbs don't get an edge in, they can't get the edge in competition. So we know grazing is powerful. So if you ever wanted to reduce forbs, you might be able to do it with grazing. Okay, now in this case, these are native forbs. Probably wouldn't want to do a massive reduction of native forb treatment plant program. But remember, a lot of the weeds that we face are forbs, so we know that sheep can be effective in reducing forbs, and some of those forbs might be weeds. Here's some work in Texas out at the Sonora Experiment Station, and on the right-hand side is goat grazing. On the left-hand side is no goat grazing. It's cattle grazing, so you can see that the goats pretty effectively got rid of the shrubs. This is live oak and other kinds of oak in this situation. Here's a picture where on the left-hand side animals were we're fenced out and it's in a fairly moist area, so these are kind of riparian or moist species on the right-hand side. They had access to it, and this is not livestock grazing, this is elk grazing here that created this fence line contrast. So winter browsing by elk reduced willows in this case. So it doesn't matter the grazing animal. Using grazing to shift the balance of competition in communities and change what the landscape looks like can be very effective. So how do livestock affect weeds? Well, it's a whole continuum. On one side, where you have fairly heavy or fairly uncontrolled grazing, you could have an increase in the spread of weeds. We know that livestock can create a disturbance. We also know that livestock can transport seeds, especially some seeds like hound's tongue, which has this kind of Velcro type characteristic, so it sticks to the hides of cows and sheep. We also know that grazing can reduce the competition of native plants and really promote weeds in a community. So on one side, you could use livestock grazing, or livestock grazing does have an effect on the spread of weeds. On the other hand, more controlled grazing can suppress weeds. You could stress the weeds, you could reduce the root biomass of weeds, you could reduce seed production of weeds, and you could reduce the competitive edge of the weeds over the native or desirable plants. So the difference along that continuum is really just that to increase the spread of weeds is done through uncontrolled or improper or ignorant grazing practices. On the other side, you could suppress weeds with targeted grazing systems, especially if they were in an integrated weed management system. On this slide, there's just a few headlines in the newspaper that have come across from using grazing for weed management. It's interesting to me that the public has really gotten behind this. So things like goats enlisted in the war on weeds sounds very exciting. I love this one. Only ewes can stop a wildfire. That was this headline out of Carson City, Nevada, where they were using sheep to reduce the fuel loads right around Carson City. Or the one that I mentioned before, the ovines, which are sheep, and vines, so sheep being used in vineyards to reduce herbaceous biomass and increase the production of grapes. Well, that's really great. I'm glad there's a lot of public interest in this. It comes down to just a few tools that are really in the tool bag for changing livestock grazing from some ubiquitous practice or even some detrimental practice into something that is really keenly used to change vegetation management. So I think about this as you're using these elements to change the role of grazing from a butter knife or a hatchet into a scalpel. So that's the idea. Being very, very careful with timing, the type of animal or herbivore, and the intensity of defoliation in order to accomplish the goals, the landscape goals. Okay, first of all, timing. Timing matters. This is a study where both sides of the fence were properly grazed. The stocking rate was right. There were no distribution problems. But on the left side, that pasture was grazed in the spring. And on the right side, it was grazed in the fall. This is a picture out of the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in DuBois. And in the fall grazing, when the sheep came through there, this taper-tip hawksbeard, which is the yellow flower there, was dormant. So the sheep did not have an effect on it. The spring grazing on the left-hand side really focused on the taper-tip hawksbeard, and therefore you can hardly see it the following spring in this slide. So there's just the timing of grazing really can change the plant community. Here's why timing matters. Thinking back to concepts that we've covered, we know that nearly all plants are palatable when they're young, when they first start to green up. They have few structural carbohydrates. They have lots of cell contents, so they have all of the digestible components, soluble components that grazing herbivores are looking for, and not many of the structural or secondary compounds. As the plant grows, however, it grows up, it becomes more structural, it might get somewhat lignified, it might gather more secondary compounds, and over time it generally becomes less palatable. Very few plants are more palatable when they're old than when they're young. Most are at high peak palatability when they're very young. On the other hand, we also know that each plant has a curve of susceptibility. And when it's young, it's fairly susceptible to grazing because there's plenty of resources and time to recover from herbivory. And when the plant starts to put all of its resources into seed set and really putting out the structural components necessary to elevate the flowers and the seeds, that's when the plant is susceptible to grazing, because it usually happens near the end of the available moisture, kind of in the middle of the growing season when available moisture becomes limited, and it happens at a time when the plant has few resources to recover from grazing. And then, of course, susceptibility to impact from herbivory goes way down when the plant senesces. So when it puts all of its carbohydrates back down into its roots, and it lets all of the above ground material senesce or die, then the plant again is not very susceptible to grazing. Okay, so looking at this graph, there are a few opportune times depending on where those curves match. There's a time often about seed set or a little before seed set where the plant is still palatable but also susceptible to grazing. So that is simple, right? Well, it would be simple out on the range if not for one problem. There's not just one plant out on the range. This curve of susceptibility and palatability is different for every plant, and so the land manager's challenging job is to find times when the weeds or the plant you're trying to reduce is palatable and susceptible, but when the native plants are not as palatable and susceptible. Okay, I've drawn this graph here because it's a situation that happens in Idaho where plants such as the winter annuals like yellow starthistle or cheatgrass are early maturing plants. So the weeds, which are the solid lines, they start growing earlier. They also become susceptible earlier, and they're palatable early on. So they're often palatable before the native plants, which are the dotted lines, become palatable and susceptible. So we have an opportunity in many rangelands in Idaho, in the northern areas, where we can graze early to get rid of some of those winter annuals at a time when they are susceptible to grazing, but the native plants aren't. So I think you gather from this that managing targeted grazing, you just have 4 basic cards you can play. You need to manage the weed. You got to manage grazing and graze when the weed is susceptible, but also relatively palatable. And you also need to graze at a time when the desired species are either at their lowest palatability or their least susceptible. So again, you have to manage curves of susceptibility and palatability of the desired plants and the weeds. It's a challenge, and it takes a good manager to do this. So again, going back to those basic tools for targeted grazing, timing is important. It's very important to get the appropriate season. Now let's talk a little bit about herbivore species, and then we'll talk about intensity. Okay, so we've seen this graph 100 times, and I don't want to keep pushing it, in front of you, but it's really important to remember that you've got to start with the right species. If you're trying to get rid of browse species, goats are a good way to start. It is true, you can get cows to eat shrubs. It's just that you've already got an animal that's designed to eat shrubs in a goat, and that's usually the best place to start. Sheep are pretty intermediate in that they will eat pretty much what's available. They can eat grass, forbs, or browse, so they're pretty useful in targeted grazing because they can be used in a variety of settings. Cattle are definitely, cattle and horses, both roughage eaters, really useful if the plant you're trying to reduce is a large fibrous plant. Here's an example. This is some pretty interesting study that was done in New Zealand where they were looking at this plant called gorse. We have a little bit of this as an invasive plant on the west coast, Washington, California, but it's not a huge problem yet. It is a problem in New Zealand, and it's this big spiny perennial plant. And what they did in the study is they cut the plant in March of 1981. They cut all the plants in the study area to 20 centimeters or so. So that's where you see that average height around 20 centimeters. And then over the next 2 years, from May 1981 to September 83, they grazed the pastures with different animals. One was raised only by sheep, one by sheep and goats, and one by goats only. And you can see that sheep had very little effect on gorse. In fact, there was really no difference between sheep grazing and no grazing at all. The gorse started growing taller and taller, and every time they measured it, it was increasing in height, and the sheep did not suppress it. The sheep and goats together did manage to keep the plant sort of at bay. It stayed about at that 20 centimeters. It went down at first and then kind of stayed at bay during the time. So it didn't have a huge effect, but it was able to suppress the height of or at least keep the height of the gorse steady. Goats, however, notice how effective they were. They started out, and from the time that goats started grazing in March 81 all the way through September, the height of the gorse, and then also in this study they measured density, diameter of stems, and cover, and all of those things went down over the time of the study, but only with goats only. So here's just a really good example of how important getting the right species is. I did a study similar to this, only I was looking at cattle and sheep, and I was looking at yellow Starthistle. So I want to make this point about how important species is. In this case, we were grazing yellow Starthistle in northern Idaho. We had cattle, sheep, and then a control that was no grazing. We grazed at 3 different times of the year. The important point is that in all of the treatments, the red bar is the control. If we had done nothing, and you'll see that no species was able to reduce the amount of yellow Starthistle below that red bar except sheep grazing late in the season when the plant was flowering. So the only time that we were able to reduce yellow Starthistle with grazing was when using sheep and when using them late in the season. I'll come back to this graph to talk about season later. Stocking rate and frequency are very important factors, and people that do targeted grazing for a living are really good at understanding how many animals to have out there, when to put them on, and when to remove them. Unfortunately, there's very few studies that look at frequency or stocking rate in relation to targeted grazing. I did one study with spotted knapweed a few years ago, and basically all I found was when you put more animals on, they eat more of the knapweed. So unfortunately, we know these things are important. Don't lose track of them, but we don't have a lot of scientific data behind them. This is the bread and butter of the targeted grazer. They're the ones that know how to do this. Okay, back to my graph. Timing, herbivore, intensity of defoliation, all very important features in targeted grazing. Now I'm just going to give you some examples. First of all, I want to be honest with you. Not everything is easy. Not every weed problem out there can be managed with targeted grazing. Some are quite easy, like cheatgrass, kudzu, yellow Starthistle, leafy spurge can be controlled. Knapweed, under the right situations, can be controlled with grazing. Others are more difficult. Western juniper, western cedar that we have in Oregon and Idaho, and the cedar they have in Oklahoma and Texas, that's a terrible hard plant to manage. There are some junipers that can be managed with grazing, but western juniper, eastern red cedar are 2 that are very difficult to control. Well, salt cedar is another one. Salt is a compound that's just very hard for animals to get through their systems, and so salt cedar, there have been some studies in trying to use grazing to suppress it, but pretty much not effective. Here I want to just give you some of the good news. Here's a study. Here's an example of using grazing for kudzu. This was some pictures that my friend Jean-Marie Lugenbuehl out of North Carolina sent to me. And in this, on the left-hand side, these are just his before grazing slides, his pictures, and then on the right-hand side is after a season of grazing. He was using goats in this study. It was really effective. I'm not even going to show you any data because you can see how effective goats can be on controlling kudzu. So it's one of the easier ones, and there's one also really nice side benefit. And that is that goats really love this stuff, and at the end of the study you have, let me just say, happy goats. At least you've got fat goats. So this is one where targeted grazing can be used quite effectively. And kudzu is quite a challenging plant, so you need something to control it, and grazing by goats and or sheep and or cows are all effective. Here's a few more examples that are a little more challenging. I'm going to show you what I know, some work I've done on leafy spurge, cheatgrass, and yellow Starthistle. So let's start with leafy spurge. Okay, we know that leafy spurge is very widespread. I have no idea how many acres, but it is from the Mississippi River to California, and maybe not in the southern states, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, not a big problem, but all the rest of the states west of the Mississippi do have a challenge with leafy spurge. Sheep and goats have both been used successfully to control it. This picture here on the left is a long paddock that was part of a study at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, and those critters in the back are some goats. And you can see that they are having no trouble keeping leafy spurge out of their pasture. The only thing that is not yellow in this picture is their pasture. Another interesting thing about leafy spurge is it's actually considered a pretty good forage for sheep and goats. There was an interesting study done in Dillon, Montana, a while back where they looked at sheep grazing leafy spurge, and they had growing lambs, and they put them on a treatment pasture, which was leafy spurge, and then the control was a native pasture. And of course they assumed that the sheep would do better on the native pasture, but much to their surprise, at the end of the season, the sheep were heavier that came off the leafy spurge pasture than the native pastures. And that's just because that their leafy spurge has this kind of latex component to it. It's in the poinsettia family, Euphorbia, the euphorb family. And that sap, that kind of sticky sap, is actually fairly high in forage value, is high energy. So the sheep came back up from that study in good shape. That's not true of all weeds, but it is true in the case of leafy spurge for goats and sheep. For cattle, not so much. That same sticky sap inside of the spurge is really does not agree with cattle. They get nauseous when they eat it. There's some other side effects. So cattle just they don't eat leafy spurge. Not that they couldn't be trained, but I don't know any cattle operators that where leafy spurge is used for forage. There are cases where cattle producers develop contracts and relationships with sheep producers to go through their pastures and remove the spurge so that they can graze the grass. Here was an interesting study that was done way back in the 50s. It was done in Canada and published in the Journal of Range Management. They were looking at using crested wheatgrass to try to suppress leafy spurge. And so they had a spurge patch and they planted it to crested wheatgrass. And you can see that in the first few years of the study, the crested wheatgrass, this is basal area, came in pretty well, and the leafy spurge was staying at a level somewhere below 5%, but it was not completely gone. So as part of the study, they decided to just see if sheep would eat the spurge, and in 1955 they put spurge in their treatment pastures, and immediately they saw a near reduction of leafy spurge, and that continued on for a few years, and the results of the study were that they had really recommended using sheep to control the leafy spurge. It's too bad we didn't listen to them, because think about this. We knew that sheep could be used to control leafy spurge since the 50s, and if we had been able to use sheep more effectively across landscapes, I would predict that we wouldn't have much trouble with spurge today. But instead, sheep populations have decreased pretty radically since the 50s, and we have a big increase in spurge on landscapes. Cause and effect? I'm not sure, but we do know, and we have known for a long time, that sheep can be used to reduce spurge. I'm going to show you some pictures because sometimes pictures speak stronger than data. Here's an example from Deer Lodge, Montana, the Deer Lodge Valley. This was a coordinated weed management group that decided to try to get rid of some of this spurge. So in this picture, there's a small ephemeral stream, and all of the yellow plants around the stream and all the way into the background are leafy spurge. This picture was taken in 2002, right before they put some sheep on the study area. The prescription for this study was to just put the sheep on until they removed the yellow, until the paddock didn't look yellow, and then they were removed. So a year later, before they put the sheep on, here's what it looked like. Almost no spurge. There's still some yellow spurge. You can still see it. This was a drier year, so you're seeing some outcropping of rocks, but not much spurge, even after 1 year of grazing. Again, a year later, right before they put the sheep on, in 2004, you start to see more of the native plants coming back. You're starting to see more in the front foreground. You're seeing some artemisia, some sagebrush. Also in the background, you're seeing more sagebrush. You're seeing very little spurge, a few little plants here and there. And then here, this was in 2005. After 4 years, you can still see the sage coming back. Very little spurge, a few plants here and there. And all they did was brought a few sheep in, put them on the pasture, removed them when the yellow was gone. And I believe they stopped the study in 2005. So just after 4 years of study, they went from a near solid leafy spurge patch to a pretty healthy landscape. Again, it was a little drier later in those years of the study, but still the native plants came back. Similar study was done in Idaho. This is along the Weiser River corridor. This is a rail-to-trail area project, and from 2003 to 2008 they grazed goats along the trail. And on the top graph you can see those old stems from last year's leafy spurge and the new spurge coming up, and hardly anything else. Yeah, there is grass underneath that understory, but mostly you see the spurge. In the bottom you can see that the spurge has been pretty well removed. A few yellow plants, but not a lot. You also see quite a bit of cheatgrass in that slide, which is a little problematic. But the other thing you see are large grass plants. You see large Great Basin wildrye plants. So after just a few years, that Great Basin wildrye was starting to come on, and the study continues to recover, today with more of that Great Basin wildrye coming in and the cheatgrass going out. So now let's talk about cheatgrass or downy brome, Bromus tectorum. It is palatable in the early spring. It's grazed by sheep and cattle and goats to some degree, but mostly sheep and cattle because it is a grass and they like grass. It's pretty easy to graze in spring, and the key is just to remove the grass before the perennial grasses of the desirable plants start to grow. Because it grows so early in the spring, there is this timing opportunity. Here's just one example. This is a study that was done by J. Davidson and Associates down in University of Nevada, Reno. They were looking at whether they could use sheep and put seeds on with the grazing to try to recover a site. And what you can see is they put sheep on in the year 2000, and the control site had twice as much pounds per acre of the cheatgrass than the ungrazed plot. So the ungrazed plot had twice as much than the grazed plot. In 2001, there was almost no cheatgrass, and the amount of cheatgrass in the control plot was going up. By 2002, this has been after planting, so a couple of years after planting, you see that it was a good cheatgrass year. The gray bar is very high. The sheep grazed area was much lower in cheatgrass. Okay, but then there's a problem. In 2002, after 2002, they took the sheep off, and by 2003, when they went back to the site, it didn't matter whether it had been grazed in the past by sheep or not. Both of those bars are really close to each other, so there really was no difference in the area that was grazed by sheep historically, previously, or the area that had not been grazed. So the bottom line is, if you're going to start grazing cheatgrass, you have to have a commitment of at least 5 years, they say, because the seeds of cheatgrass last 5 or more years. So because there was a seed bank, when you remove the sheep, the cheatgrass took advantage of that. I'm going to go back to the study that I did on yellow star thistle, because now I want to make a point about why the season is so important and some things that we've learned by studying yellow star thistle. So this study was done up in northern Idaho, and you can see a picture there of the different plots. It was a replicated study, and if you know anything about yellow star thistle, you probably hate it. It's got these terrible spines that stick out from under the yellow seed head. Again, this study, we looked at plant response to grazing with cattle, sheep, or none. We looked at 3 phenological stages: the rosette when it's very young, bolting when that seed head starts to come up, and then flowering. It was a fully replicated study, so that meant we had 27 small paddocks with a few sheep in each paddock or one steer. Okay, this is the graph I showed you, and we found out that we can reduce yellow star thistle density with sheep grazing in the fall. So, however, notice that if we graze with either cattle or sheep in the spring, we end up with more yellow star thistle than if we hadn't grazed it at all. And that has to do with when we graze it in the spring, especially right when it's kind of starting to put up that seed head, which it does really early, the plant actually is stimulated to put out more lateral stems. So any plant that is grazed responds by sending out some lateral stems. If we graze it in the bolting phase, that's usually a little bit later in the season, so the plant isn't as able to recover, so it's about the same as not grazing it at all. Grazing in the fall with cattle had no effect. In fact, we had more leafy spurge, more star thistle with cattle grazing in the fall. So again, the only treatment by which we were able to reduce yellow star thistle was sheep grazing in the fall. And then this is just another graph that looks at plant density the following spring. So if we grazed one year, what did it look like the following spring? And the bottom line here is that the grazing had no effect. There was a difference in graze and no graze, but all of the grazed plots had more yellow star thistle the year following grazing than those that were controlled. So that was a real bummer. We were hoping to use grazing as a targeted grazing control, and we found out that it's pretty ineffective. It's completely ineffective, in fact, in this community. We do know that yellow star thistle has forage value, so at least we were able to use it as a forage. but we weren't able to control it with cattle or sheep. So then after that I met this fellow here, Ray Holes, and he said, well, let's do some grazing with goats. And I tried to explain to Ray, I've looked at goats, I've looked at grazing in Starthistle, and there's really not much we can do about it. And he said, no, I've done it. He has a company called Prescriptive Livestock Services. He's one of the most highly revered targeted grazers in the country, and he said, no, let's give it a try. So for whatever reason, I trusted Ray, and we went to the Forest Service with some good help from some of the Forest Service personnel in Grangeville to put together a contract to do the NEPA analysis to do a vegetation management project with goats on yellow Starthistle. And on the bottom slide there you see that I hired some grad students, and about any student that walked in my office those few years of the study to help me put out fenced areas where the goats were not going to be able to graze inside, so that we could look at grazed and ungrazed area. And what you can see there is just that was really steep country. And it was some of the most challenging area that I've ever worked in. It was over 1,000-acre pasture, so this was some landscape scale research. So the question is, were the goats effective? We put out 24 of those small fenced-in areas, so we had a control and a graze treatment at 24 spots across this landscape. If you know anything about topo maps, look how close those lines are, and you can tell this was pretty steep country. I nearly died twice on that hill. And here's the data. Here's the results. Who needs data? Here's the results. On the left-hand side is inside one of the exclosures, and on the right-hand side is outside that very same exclosure 2 years after the grazing treatments had been applied. You can see there's very little yellow Starthistle outside the paddock. And in fact, Brianna Goering, who is the student who did this study, her research involved also looking at how the survival of seeds through the digestive tract of a goat or a sheep. So we had to go back and collect some seed heads of yellow Starthistle, and I'm not kidding you, it actually was challenging to find enough seed heads in 1,000 acres for us to do her study on this plant. The other thing that might have helped is that we have done some research on yellow Starthistle that shows when you reduce the amount of seed heads out there, you really concentrate all of the biocontrol agents in the area on the remaining seed heads. So the biocontrol insects then can kind of finish off the job that the goats didn't do. So I think the biocontrol helped us because there were flea beetles and others on this site. Just the data is very clear. If you look at the seed heads per plant, the goats completely chomped on the seed heads, which really surprised me because the seed heads have these long spines. But the inside of the goat's mouth is kind of leathery, so I think they're able to handle it. And then also those spines really break down quickly in saliva. Plus, those seed heads are really high energy. So easily can reduce the number of seed heads per plant, which reduce the number of plants per plot in the grazed versus the ungrazed area. The good news is there weren't a lot of target effects. We were able to reduce the yellow Starthistle cover. These data were just after our first year of study, and after 2 more treatments we had much greater differences in the grazed and ungrazed area. However, we never did change the components of other forbs in the community. Even though goats, you might be expected to eat forbs, there was never a difference in the grazed and ungrazed areas in native forbs, and the amount of grass was actually more in the grazed area than the ungrazed. Again, because goats were grazing the yellow Starthistle and not the grass, and it was giving an advantage back to the grass. There was not a lot of perennial grass on the site, so a lot of these were annual or short perennial grasses such as Poa bulbosa. So increasing the cover of grass was not a huge it wasn't a great advantage, but the next step on this study would be to go in and do some restoration and get the grass back into the system, because now we know we can get rid of the Starthistle, just need to get the grass back. There's a lot of benefits of targeted grazing. I gave you some examples. It can be very highly effective. It can be used to improve pasture quality overall at a pasture scale. It also has no herbicide or pesticide residue, so it's very environmentally friendly. I've gotten calls over the years from many newspapers asking me about this new environmentally friendly technique called grazing. So it's kind of exciting that it is getting a lot of energy from people that are very environmentally conscious. It can have a lower effect on non-target plants. It is true that you can have damage to non-target species, but it can often be lower than it would be with alternatives such as herbicides. Another advantage is you can convert the weeds into something you can sell. Usually the goal of targeted grazing is the vegetation management. A byproduct is meat and wool and hides, and so that sellable product is something that can be used to promote weed control into the future. So it can be viewed as a more sustainable control method. It's not a pay-for-itself method, but it can be at least more sustainable because there is something going back into the control. Another great thing about targeted grazing is it can be used in really rough terrain. I showed you those pictures from Bent's Ridge where I did the yellow Starthistle project, and that was really tough country. The goats didn't seem to notice. They really used that country well. Other costs of targeted grazing. So there's lots of benefits, but there's some costs also. Certainly a cost for the animals. There's some issues with potential losses because some of the landscapes can be tough and remote, but also there's potential losses because some of the landscapes that we use targeted grazing on are right near towns, and then there's issues with dogs and other animals right at the urban interface. Of course, fencing, waters, herders, trailers, all of that is much more intense in the targeted grazing situation, so it costs a lot more. You can have reduced animal production. I talked about sheep getting a benefit from leafy spurge, but in most cases when you're grazing weeds, you're doing it in a very targeted way, and you can pay a price in animal production. The biggest problem, the biggest cost with targeted grazing is what I say: you can't hang them in the barn. Sheep got to eat, cows got to eat. If they're doing targeted grazing projects, goats got to eat every day of the year, 365 days of the year, 24/7. Well, not quite 24 hours a day, but every day. They need to eat, they need to drink, and you can't just, if you don't need them, if you don't have a contract, you can't just hang them up in the barn. So the idea or the goal of making targeted grazing a truly useful tool is that we're going to have to find ways to use more animals in more different settings so that we can move them as weeds become a problem on different parts of the landscape. It also takes time. If you're going to go into the targeted grazing solution, you can't do it in 1 year and one treatment. It takes several years. It requires long-term planning. It's hard to have a short-term high impact. It can look good that first year, but you got to go back the next year. So what we tend to find with targeted grazing is that you have a lot of animals in the first couple years of study, and then you start to see a real decrease, and then you go into sort of a maintenance level. Ray Holes, the targeted grazer that I know, says oftentimes it's challenging because when you do that first year of a study, you've created a disturbance and you've got seeds in the soil bank, so you actually oftentimes have an increase in weed the second year. And it's not until the third or fourth year that you start to get into that maintenance level. Once you're done at maintenance, you can do a lot more acres with a lot fewer animals in a much shorter time, so the cost goes way down. But those first few years can be very expensive to have the desired effect. Now, as we kind of go into the end of this presentation is called Integrated Weed Management. It's really important to remember that no matter what you're doing for weed control, it needs to be integrated with all possible options in the tool bag. The traditional four categories of weed management are chemical, biocontrol, which usually is insects or rusts, and the thing about biocontrol is very specific to an individual plant. Cultural are things like grazing and fire. These are activities that are natural in the landscape, and we use them in very specific ways. I'm sorry, they're not natural. They're activities that are natural but also managed on the landscape, and we can manage them in ways to reduce weeds. Then finally, mechanical. Taking a shovel and digging a weed out of the ground is mechanical. Taking a mower or a harrow out to the ground to reduce weeds, that would be mechanical. So again, chemical, biocontrol, cultural, mechanical. All of those are options. They can work together. You can, for example, use chemicals and follow up with grazing and have a benefit for both the beneficial effect for both the chemical and the goat or the targeted grazing. I It does depend on a lot of skill and knowledge. Remember I said it takes skill of livestock management and also skill of landscape understanding. You can go to my web page that I maintained on targeted grazing, which is the address is up on the top. If you Google targeted grazing or prescribed grazing, you'll probably end up at this site. A lot of good information here. Probably the two best pieces of information are these two handbooks. One is a book that's called Targeted Grazing that I was able to edit with my colleague John Walker a few years ago, 2001 I believe. So it's pretty relatively new information. It goes through the principles of targeted grazing, it goes through individual prescriptions for plants, and then it goes through the enterprise levels. That is available online or through the American Sheep Industry Association printed. There's also a good book that was done by Linda Wilson, Jay Davidson, and Ed Smith out of Nevada, and this book is a listing of guidelines or prescriptions plant by plant, and they gather these prescriptions from people who do targeted grazing and from what research there exists. So if you've got a plant, and just like you might go to a herbicide guideline for how to kill it, you can also go to this book to get a guideline for western weeds, at any rate, when they should be grazed by what animal for how long. So that's the end. I think there's a lot of hope for the future in targeted grazing. We are just at the very beginning of trying to turn this from a few ideas and a few tools and a few people who know how to do it into an enterprise. But every year we're seeing more and more people who are going into the business of targeted grazing, where they're buying livestock and equipment to do vegetation management with livestock.